I'm a 15-year-old girl, homeless, unable to claim benefits, and with a substantial amount of trauma behind me to severely change my perception of life, people, and relationships. Life back then was all about trauma. I worked my way from the bottom up in the newspaper industry to the lofty heights of senior management, managing 28 newspapers. But my personal life was in a mess, full of fear, isolation, and desperate loneliness. At the age of 33, I started to question my life purpose. Selling newspapers didn't really have the same appeal as it used to, and I had this nagging feeling that there was more to life than my current experiences. So I decided to take a sabbatical from my job. I traveled to the Philippines to think about my future. When I got there, the first thing I did was read a newspaper, and I read stories of families who were living in broken down shanties. Small, dark, being bulldozed, demolished by bulldozers to make way for new roads. Well, I'd never seen a shanty before. I'd never seen a squatter area. I didn't know what they looked like, so I jumped in a taxi and I asked the taxi driver to take me to the worst squatter area that he knew. He wasn't keen. He said it wasn't safe for white women, so I promised that I'd stay in the taxi. But as soon as we got to the shanty area, I jumped out for a closer look because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Families living in these dark, tiny shacks. They were no bigger than a small garden shed. There was no running water, no electricity, no sanitation. The walls were made of second-hand pieces of wood that were nailed together, and there were rusty sheets of corrugated metal that were put on top with an old car tire to make the roof. I felt sick in my stomach that families would actually call these places home. And I know this sounds really horrible, but our animals, they live in better living conditions than these families did. And in the distance, I could see two little boys. One of them was dragging a sack behind him, and the other had a hook in his hand. And I didn't know what they were doing, so I followed them, and I followed them up to a dirt track. Again, I couldn't believe what I was seeing because there were hundreds of children everywhere, some of them just as young as 2 years of age, and they were knee-deep in rubbish, foraging around, looking for pieces of plastic and metal to put in their sack. Their tiny bodies were bruised and cut and dirty, and the smell on this dump site was so putrid, I just wanted to gag. There was rotten food and hospital waste, and the abattoir, it had dumped a load of carcasses, and the air was thick with black smoke where they were burning charcoal and car tires. There was nothing dignified about this place, and yet this place was the place where I had my epiphany moment. This was the place where everything in my entire world changed. Because when I looked at these children, I realized that their entire lives were destined to be spent living and working in other people's trash. I realized that they were not able to change their own futures, and the hopelessness of that, well, it reminded me of how I used to feel when I was a child. Horrible things were happening to me, and I wasn't able to stop them, and it took me back to a really dark place, a time that I had tried to forget. My childhood was problematic, difficult. My sister and I had been separated by the courts, and we lived 8 years apart before the courts granted my mum custody back of my sister. I was well looked after, but the essential ingredients for a healthy, secure childhood were definitely missing. My father had one of the most explosive tempers. My mother was a nervous wreck. She was so emotionally unstable, she tried to commit suicide. And actually, so did I at the age of 12. When I was 15, my parents sat me down and they said to me, look, we don't want you living with us anymore. You know, we want you to either go into care, go to social services, or you can live with your aunt and uncle. They live in Cornwall. Well, of course, I wanted to live with my aunt and uncle because they were in Cornwall. I thought, wow, this is amazing. This is a fresh start, just what I wanted. But 2 months after being there, my uncle raped me. So I found myself in Bournemouth, homeless and alone. But I was one of the lucky ones because I managed to get a job in a hotel as a live-in chambermaid, and that managed to save me from the horrors of living on the streets. But I was still haunted by my past. I threw myself into work, drugs, drink, anything to escape. And now, I am now in front of these children on this dump site, and I can see the despair in their faces. And really, all I want to do is put my hands in my pocket and give these kids all the money that I have and just tell them that I hope everything works out for them. I just wanted to run away. But I remembered the teacher who didn't report the bruises that she found on me, and the social workers who didn't believe my story, and the doctors that didn't treat my illnesses and my eating disorders, and eventually the policewoman who told me to run away because my uncle was going to rape me again. I was a professional now. I was the one who had the ability to help. And what kind of person would I be if I didn't help these children? I didn't want to be the same as the doctor, the social worker, the teacher, the policewoman. I could see the cry of help in their eyes. And so I decided that I would do everything I possibly could to try and give them a better future. I went back to England, and I decided that I'd build them a daycare centre, 60 children, from my own savings. And I started to study about why there were child labour issues in the Philippines and how I could run a charity. And I quickly realised that the daycare centre was never going to make that much difference to the children. I really needed to be able to give them an education and give them the tools and the resources they needed to change their own future. I shared this information with my sister, and she said she'd help me fundraise. And so with that, I went back to the Philippines. I sat down with the parents, and I said to them, what else would you like me to do for you? And they said, educate our children, don't let them live like us. And they directed me to this really old, dilapidated warehouse. It was filthy. We all went down and we cleaned it, we painted it. I bought second-hand furniture and a big sign outside saying teachers apply within. And that was the beginning of the school. There were so many challenges in trying to get this charity and this work for these children off the ground. In this 15-minute presentation, I'm never going to be able to tell you them, but there are a couple of things that really stick out in my mind. And one of them was the day that the children came to school, and they were so fidgety, they were so hungry they couldn't concentrate. So I used to feed them a really, really good meal and give them snacks. And I kept weighing them and measuring them to make sure they were gaining weight and growing. But they weren't. So I took them to the paediatrician. And as soon as the paediatrician found out where these children came from, the first thing he said to me was, oh my goodness, he goes, they're riddled with intestinal worms. He said, I'll give you a chocolate milk drink. Give this to the children. It will get rid of the worms. Well, this is where I made my first monumental mistake, because I wormed 250 children on a Thursday. Yeah, you know, don't you, what happened on the Friday when they all came into school? Yeah, we always worm on a Friday now. The second thing is that the children kept missing days from school, though. You know, even though we were providing like wonderful services for them, they still kept missing their days from school. And I asked the parents why, and they said, oh, well, because the children needed to go to work. Well, I didn't understand that. You know, why do the children need to go to work? So I asked the parents if I could live with them just for a couple of weeks, just, you know, so I could understand what was going on. The one thing I know is that sometimes when you make those courageous steps and you do it out of deep love and concern for another person, wonderful things can happen. And what I discovered was it wasn't the parents forcing the children to go to work. Far from it. It was these beautiful children. They wanted to go to work, because they worked out that if they don't work, they don't eat, and if they don't eat, they starve, and their brothers and sisters might starve with them as well. So they joyfully went to work on the dump site with their parents. There was no resentment or bitterness in them, and yet their childhoods were being robbed from them as they bared the weight of adulthood on their shoulders. They all worked together as a team. So now I'm on the dump site with the families, and a lot of them didn't know what I was doing there, but they didn't care. They just kept showing me what waste was valuable, what waste I needed to pick to put in my sack. And I was a pretty bad waste picker, because even after 4 hours, I didn't have much in my sack. And the kids used to feel really sorry for me. They used to keep putting their waste in my sack. You know, when your face is like 2 inches away from the ground, because you had to bend down like really close to the ground to see the little pieces of plastic and metal that you needed to pick up, you know, that smell was like 1,000 times worse. And the ground was moving, you know, because of the maggots and everything that was on the ground. I was thinking this has to be the worst job on the planet. There can't be another job worse than this, working in other people's trash, physically exhausting. And you know, on the dump site, there were like thousands of plastic bags everywhere, all over. And everybody would be like jabbing their hooks in the plastic bags, and they'd be giving them a good shake, and there'd be like liquid coming out of them, but they were looking for little pieces of plastic or metal or anything glass that they could recycle. So I just copied them. And what I didn't realize is that as I was shaking these bags, this liquid actually was human waste. You know, because the thing is, there's no sanitation on that dump site. So the only way they could get rid of their human waste was to put it in a little tiny piece of newspaper, tie it up in a plastic bag, you know, and throw. I called it the wrap and throw method. And so as I'm busy, you know, shaking these bags, trying to copy them, you know, I'm just getting covered in excrement the same as they were. All I wanted at the end of the day was like a hot bath, you know, just desperate for that. And I think the mothers, they knew that, so they came and they gave me this bowl of water. It was about 4 inches of water, cold water in it, and a tiny, tiny piece of soap about the size of a 10-pence piece. And I'm concentrating so hard because I'm really scrubbing because I just want to get all this, you know, all this excrement and everything and the smells off me. And I wasn't really looking at what was going on around me, but, you know, just for a second I looked up. And when I looked up, there was about 300 Filipinos all stood around me watching me take this bath on the dump site. I suppose they weren't used to seeing white women do that. Afterwards, we went back to the shanty and we tipped all of our waste that we collected that day, and we segregated it into little piles of plastic and metal, and we took it to a man. He had a great big like weighing scales, and he weighed the waste for us. And then with the money that we had earned that day, we went off and bought some rice and noodles, and that was our evening meal. So we all had it on one plate, eating with our hands. Children at night, they wrapped up my feet in their clothes because they said that the rats might come in and nibble my hard skin. Their life was so horrific. And yet they carried on just normally, just like we do. You know, they laughed, they chatted, they cooked, they cleaned. You know, even though their house was a shanty, it was on a stinking rubbish dump. You know, they still swept the floors, everything was still clean. They grew accustomed to things like the rats. You know, the rats were enormous on this dump site. They were like this big, you know, because they had a continual source of food. And they got mange, a lot of them, and it's two words that should never be put together, rats and mange, because, you know, they just look absolutely terrifying when they've got no hair. and the insects, there's so many insects. Spiders as big as your hands, cockroaches, when they are fully grown, they grow wings, they fly everywhere. And they all had, like, skin diseases, you know, and all loads of sickness, diarrhea, sicknesses, and just so much suffering going on. But they just carried on with a smile on their faces, and this was their life. Just like we would do, we just flick the kettle, have a cup of tea. It was just all normal to them. So everything they own it really lightly, you know, because there's so many typhoons. And, you know, fire, you know, when you're cooking off charcoal, a spark can hit the wood, and if it's not attended to, every house, every shanty will just burn down. So they own everything very, very lightly. And I'm asking them, how do they manage, you know, with all this stress, how do they manage? And they sat me down and they said to me, you know what, Jane, it's like this. You know, sometimes bad things happen, and sometimes good things happen. Nothing ever lasts. Good times come, bad times come. But there's only one thing that we can ever depend on, and that's the love that we have in our hearts for our family, for each other. Wow, it just blew me away. You know, because that was a new concept for me. And what I realized is whatever bad things they were going through, because they didn't seem to hold any bitterness or resentment for any of these things, I realized that I also could let go of those emotions that bound me to my past, that made me feel inadequate, that made me feel less of a person. I could let them go. They taught me so much just by being who they were. Their lives made such a difference to me. And as I spent more time with them, I started to learn other things. that weren't so nice. When the mothers and sometimes the teenage girls, when they need money for medicines and they need to get that money quickly, the only way to get it is to go and sell their bodies on the street for a few pence. Sometimes the pimps and the paedophiles, and there seemed to be quite a few of them, would come onto the dump site and steal the children that were unsupervised, and the parents had no idea where they'd gone. Nearly every baby that was born severely malnourished, and so many of them die. And talking of death, nearly every single person on that dump site had lost a brother or a sister or a parent. Death was something that was so normal. It was an everyday occurrence. I could feel their pain when they told me these stories. They opened up their souls to me, and I could feel that pain. And what it did is it changed my heart for them so much, because I then became absolutely feeling so protective towards them. I didn't want them to have any more suffering, because no person, no family, nobody should have to endure what they endure and what they continue to endure. My heart is filled with respect for these people, absolutely. The world sometimes looks upon them as just poor people, and they don't really amount to anything, and they make judgments on them, and they make decisions that affect their lives, that hurt them. But they have no idea the beauty that I found in them as people, as individuals, as families, as a community. They changed not only my life, but they changed my sister's too, because she gave up a really well-paid job to stand by my side. And together we decided that we would try and do whatever it took to try and create a pathway out of poverty for these families. So we built a school. We built an enormous school made out of recycled shipping container vans. It turned out to be the world's first, but it was large enough to end child labour on that dump site. We've educated in over 16,000 children, provided different skills training for families so they have different alternatives to supplement their income. And our health programs, they've helped nearly over 100,000 people at least. So many lives have been saved through those programs. And one of the really, really fun things that we did is we went onto the dump site and we found recycled bits of plastic and recycled glossy magazines, and we started to make them into products. We taught the families how to make beads from glossy magazines and things from toothpaste tubes, and we took the ring pulls from Coke cans, soda cans, and we made them into beautiful bags and clothes and jewellery, and we showed them that there was other things they could do with trash other than just collecting it and selling it for a few pesos a kilo. It's provided sustainable work for thousands of people. And we've taken this concept as well, and we've not just done that here, but we've also done it in other countries on other dump sites, and we're expanding that program. I feel so privileged to be in the position I've been. I feel like I owe them my life. I feel that my happiness has been owed to those families. And so many people that has partnered with us, I think, have felt the same. I have no idea how to end this talk. All I can say is, when we learn to live with courage and we learn to love courageously, it not only changes the world of the people that we're trying to serve, but it also changes, well, it changed my world. I guess it would change your worlds as well. Thank you so much for listening.
I told you. Thank you very much, Jane Walker. Are you hearing this? Oh, you're coming back on?